Welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're embarking on a cinematic journey straight through the 20th century. We're going to witness the painful, deeply dramatic struggle for nation building in two massively contrasting regions, Latin America and China. Let's unpack exactly how these nations fought off foreign domination to build the modern states we recognize today.
Here's our map for today's journey. We'll start with the context and causes, move right into the decades of upheaval, cover the trauma and transition, and finish up with the modern legacies of nation building.
Section 1. Context and Causes, the Seeds of Revolution. Let's examine the structural forces that ignited the need for change.
Okay, to really grasp this era, we've got to start with one crucial concept: national sovereignty. Ultimately, the absolute lack of it, whether that was due to foreign interference or deep internal fractures, was the primary spark for the conflicts we're about to explore. Both Latin America and China were desperately searching for systems that could finally deliver justice, prosperity, and true independence to their people.
Now, when you compare their root grievances, a pretty stark contrast emerges. Latin America was crippled by extreme economic inequality. You had land and wealth concentrated in the hands of a very small elite, while foreign corporations essentially controlled key industries. Think oil in Mexico or sugar in Cuba. China's starting point, on the other hand, was entirely different, but man, equally devastating. They were emerging from what's known as the Century of Humiliation, marked by imperial collapse, a weakening Qing dynasty, and massive foreign invasions, like the Opium Wars. Think about Chinese society right before Mao Zedong's communist victory in 1949. It was just absolutely devastated. After the fall of the Qing dynasty, the country descended into warlordism. They endured decades of brutal civil war, communists versus nationalists, and suffered a horrific Japanese occupation during World War II. What the new leaders inherited was a thoroughly war-torn, largely agrarian nation that desperately needed unification.
Meanwhile, over in Latin America, it was essentially a pressure cooker. Just imagine millions of indigenous, mestizo, and Afro-Latino people living in deep poverty while the Cold War raged all around them. The United States, absolutely terrified of the spread of communism, started actively supporting military governments that promised to suppress any leftist movements. And even in places that managed to avoid outright military dictatorship, like Mexico, you still saw one-party dominance. The PRI controlled politics there via patronage and fraud for literally decades.
Section 2. Decades of Upheaval, Revolution, and the Cold War. Let's dive right in.
So the Cold War essentially turned both of these massive regions into giant geopolitical battlegrounds through what we call proxy wars. Because of the looming, constant threat of nuclear annihilation between the US and the Soviet Union, these global superpowers pulled the strings from behind the scenes. They used smaller nations and third parties to do the actual fighting on their behalf.
The mid-century saw this relentless cascade of revolutions and counter-revolutions. Look at the timeline. In 1959, Fidel Castro takes Cuba. The U.S. responds with a failed Bay of Pigs invasion in '61. Fast forward to 1973, Chile's elected socialist president, Salvador Allende, is overthrown in a military coup, which leads to General Augusto Pinochet's brutal dictatorship. Then, in 1979, the Sandinistas overthrow the Somoza dictatorship in Nicaragua. And what happens next? The U.S. funds the Contra rebels in a covert proxy war throughout the 1980s. It was literally a whole region violently swinging back and forth between revolution and intervention.
Pivoting back over to China, upheaval took a very different, much more internal form, and that form was collectivization. This was a radical economic restructuring tool heavily utilized by Mao Zedong's government as they attempted to rapidly, and I mean rapidly, transform their agrarian society. Now, the Chinese Communist Party did unify a highly fragmented country, but they subjected it to radical, often totally devastating political campaigns to get there. After establishing the Republic in 1949 and flexing some early military ambition in the Korean War in 1950, they launched the Great Leap Forward in '58 to force rapid industrialization. Later on, from 1966 to 1976, the Cultural Revolution mobilized Red Guards to completely destroy traditional culture and purge any political opponents. The crucial, inescapable point we have to acknowledge here is the staggering human cost of these rapid policies. We're talking an estimated 30 to 45 million people dead in the famine caused by the Great Leap Forward. That is a number so huge it's almost impossible to comprehend, right? But it's absolutely vital to understanding the deep trauma of China's mid-century nation building.
Section 3. Trauma and Transition, Violence and Reform in the Late 20th Century. Tragically, maintaining authority in both hemispheres often resulted in state-sponsored violence. That's governments literally turning their vast power and military resources directly against their own citizens through horrific acts like systematic torture or disappearances.
Whether we're looking at Latin America or China, the scale of suppression was immense. Take Argentina during the so-called Dirty War from '76 to '83. The military government effectively disappeared an estimated 30,000 political opponents. Over in China, the profound social trauma of the Cultural Revolution was followed by the events of 1989, where the government violently suppressed pro-democracy demonstrators in Tiananmen Square. They made a clear choice: state stability over democratic reform.
Yet, even amidst all this darkness in Latin America, some incredible voices of civil resistance emerged. You had the unbelievably courageous Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo marching right in Buenos Aires, demanding accountability for their missing children. You had powerful figures like Archbishop Oscar Romero in El Salvador utilizing liberation theology to connect the Catholic faith directly to social justice for the poor. Ultimately, it was these exact grassroots movements and massive internal pressures that forced most Latin American nations to actually transition to elected civilian governments by the 1990s.
Meanwhile, in China, following Mao's death, leader Deng Xiaoping initiated a highly dramatic economic pivot. He introduced the Four Modernizations and actively opened China's doors to foreign investment by establishing special economic zones. I mean, look at Shenzhen. It went from a sleepy little fishing town to a booming global megacity in just a few decades. This shifted China toward a market-oriented economy, lifting literally hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. But, and this is the absolute key takeaway here, it did all of this while strictly maintaining one-party communist control.
Latin American democracies were also eagerly embracing global economic integration. In 1994, NAFTA officially linked Mexico, the US, and Canada. But, as you can guess, the outcomes were incredibly complex. While it created these massive, ambitious trade networks that keep our grocery stores stocked today, it also economically displaced millions of Mexican farmers. And that displacement contributed significantly to large waves of immigration to the United States.
Section 4. Legacies of Nation Building. Divergent Paths.
What's truly fascinating here is seeing how these parallel mid-century struggles produced completely divergent realities in our modern world. The core difference today really comes down to a fundamental choice. Will a nation prioritize strict, authoritarian obedience and stability, or will it endure the messy, complex, and ongoing process of democratization?
Let's look at China's legacy. It's the legacy of an undeniable global superpower. Through brilliant economic statecraft, like the Belt and Road Initiative and their strategic entry into the World Trade Organization, they are actively reshaping the post-World War II international order. Yet, they maintain that strict authoritarian stability we talked about, and that leaves major unresolved geopolitical flashpoints remaining, especially around the status of Taiwan and the autonomy of Hong Kong.
Latin America's legacy, on the flip side, shows a region far stronger in its democratic commitments than it was a century ago. But they're still battling the ghosts of their past. Persistent, deeply rooted inequality remains a massive hurdle. And honestly, this has frequently paved the way for the rise of populism. Think of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, who used oil wealth to fund social programs but ultimately undermined democratic institutions. That resulted in some severe economic instability that the country is still grappling with today. So, we're left with this staggering contrast. China achieved its massive rise to become the world's second-largest economy under strict one-party rule. Though it's worth noting they now face long-term challenges, like the demographic imbalance left by the one-child policy, along with rising global tension. Latin America, meanwhile, weaves this very complex tapestry of civilian governments. Despite their hard-won democratic gains, they still wrestle with persistent poverty, complex immigration issues, and occasionally democratic backsliding.
As we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with a question to chew on. When we look back at the historical crucibles of both Latin America and China, the immense sacrifices, the revolutions, the proxy wars, the massive economic pivots, we aren't just looking at dusty history in a textbook. How do these foundational blueprints continue to redefine the global order and the delicate balance of power that we all live in right now?